Gosh, thank you very much, Caroline. That sounded quite impressive. I'm going to now let you down gently. So it's a very great honour to be here, and thank you, Caroline and Martin, and for all the other people who've helped organise such a lovely conference. I am taking the theme of the conference very seriously, this theme of flexibility and resilience. So lots of people to thank, their names are here, but particularly I'd like to thank my co-lead in the Ambit project, Peter Fugel, but many other people. And the other people I would like to thank in advance are the sort of mentalizing metaphor in the box over here, our interpreters who are making or trying to make sense of what I say and to translate that in understandable ways. I'm very grateful. Okay, one of the things that we do when we work with young people whose approach to help seeking is very non-standard is to work hard to encourage our workers to broadcast their intentions, to, if you like, show the young person in very explicit, transparent, ostensive ways what their intent is, because it's very easy for us to assume that my intentions in the work that I'm doing are clear to the young person I'm approaching, whereas in fact, in reality, they may have very different ideas. So I have some intentions. I want to, this is in England we call this the graveyard shift after lunch, when everybody's feeling a little cross. So I'm going to try to keep you interested and awake, thinking about these two ideas of flexibility and resilience. I'm going to spend a little bit of time being rude about another group of people who are far enough away from the work that we do that I won't be accused of hypocrisy, because most of what I do is encourage people to be generous to the other professionals in the field. But I'm going to have a bit of a knock at the rocket scientists. I want to think not very much about the work that we do face-to-face with young people. I want to encourage us to think more broadly, and particularly in Ambit, we think of 4 quadrants of work: working with our clients, working with our teams, working with our networks, and then the broader notion of a team that's learning at work. And I'm going to think about, very briefly, those other 3 quadrants and how mentalizing can underpin that. And in the end, I'm trying to kind of invite us to think about systems that can become more mindful of the minds that make them up. And I'll say something about Ambit's learning approach, how we really put flexibility and local adaptation at the very heart of Ambit. So one of the phrases that we come out with a lot is, there is no such thing as an Ambit team. There are many teams that are influenced by Ambit, and I don't think I wanted any other way than that. So just a quick reminder, vulnerability is another word that comes into the language, resilience and flexibility. Vulnerability, as I would see it, is a lack of protection from stress. Here's a man demonstrating a lovely, rather adolescent form of vulnerability. He can go as fast as anybody else. He can even maybe take corners if he's feeling in great balance. But if he falls off, he will get hurt in a way that the person wearing a helmet and leathers and appropriate footwear will not. What about resilience? Resilience is that sort of elasticity, the bouncing back to kind of recover previous shape. And here is where flexibility and resilience are so closely connected. So flexibility is that adaptive change that responds to environmental challenges. Here, the wind blowing the tree bends over to reduce wind resistance. And that maintains, if you like, its kind of quote-unquote intentional stance to survive this particular gale. So let's now think about the world of work. I'm thinking about work with young people who are out of school, They're beginning to commit crime. They're using drugs and alcohol. They have maybe past histories of abuse, trauma, neglect. Many of them are either on the verge of being homeless or are actively homeless or being exploited by various other people out there sexually in terms of gang involvement. And they attract a very large collection of professionals around them. Youth offence teams, mental health teams, social care teams, housing teams, education inclusion teams. I'm sure it's very similar in most of the countries that we come from. And it's common when you say, I work with this thing, for people kind of to say, well, you know, just walking around being nice to people, aren't you? You're just being kind. It's not rocket science. And it did get me thinking that these rocket scientists, it's really unfair. They've cornered the market in a definition of what it is to do complicated, difficult work. And just to point out that they don't get it right all the time. This is Elon Musk's incredibly clever rocket that goes up, and then it lands vertically and can be used again. But if I can get my computer to do it, it doesn't always work. It looks great, really clever. But then, this makes me feel so good. Unfortunately, so many of my treatment attempts are a little bit like that. But so, seriously, I do want to lay claim that the work that we do with these very complicated, multi-professional, multi-agency networks, they make rocket science look incredibly simple. And we don't applaud ourselves for that complexity that we work in. We underplay that. So just thinking about that complexity, here's a family, a young person in crisis, who's in relationship with two parents and a sibling in their own system. This young person is herself a system, interactions between her biology and her psychology. And outside of that, there's a social ecology, her extended family, her peers, her culture. There are opportunities. She's subject perhaps to a range of different discriminations. And outside of that, there's a local service ecology, which differs from town to town and city to city and country to country. There are health, social, legal and education reorganisations, and certainly in the UK, reorganisations, and I'm sure we're now onto the reorganisations, so that this is a territory that is in constant flux. And outside of that, there's an economic and political context, which is equally subject to flux, and funding and outcomes targets are changed. And there's also a media context around particularly the group of young people that I work with who are highly stigmatized, highly excluded, and highly risky. And this makes for a complicated world. So different services come into this field of work with different priorities. A youth offending service is there to keep young people out of the prison system. A social services department is there to, moderate the effects of parental abuse or neglect, and to ensure that safeguarding protocols are kept to. A mental health service may be there to improve a young person's mental health. And the different professionals in these models spend maybe many years training in models of practice, ways of making sense of this particular world, ways of making sense and a language that describes the problem according to that model. And this makes for interesting times. It's very common that these, what we would call disintegrations, take place. Very often for the young person or the family, they have an experience that we've described as the Tower of Babel. A social worker who's talking the language of deprivation and opportunities, a psychiatrist who's talking about neurotransmitters and heritable characteristics, a psychotherapist who's talking about states of emotion, states of mind. They're all right, but from the young person's point of view, they all appear to be disagreeing. And it's very easy in that situation for our best intentions in a multi-agency network to deliver an experience of care that is aversive, that is just too many people trying to create relationships and all of them appearing at least to disagree. And often, in my experience, and maybe the same with you, often in real terms, very fierce debates can break out. I mentioned the media. I mean, these are very anxious times for anybody in this field. You know, there's a lack of resource, and there's also an increasing emphasis on risk management and on protocols. When something goes wrong, somebody is to blame. So where does this take us? Well, anybody who's done most of the MBT trainings will have seen this very simplified diagram. It's really all you need to know about mentalizing. You either have mentalizing and your stress and arousal attachment system is quiet, or you have your stress and arousal system and your mentalizing is drowned out by the high volume of those limbic, mainly limbic systems. So this is a problem. It means that for the worker in this field, they're like this. Most of you are too young to remember these toys. This was the most exciting toy of my childhood. It's called a Weeble. In fact, I think I have one. I need to show you my Weeble. When I was a child, this was the summit of exciting toys. And the slogan in the advertising was, "Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down." And for me, mentalizing is the weight at the bottom that helps to correct and refine the balance. He's turned around to look at me. He should be looking at you. So the worker is like this Weeble, constantly being pulled by the different demands and the anxious context that we're working in. So ambit is an approach that really takes seriously the need for us to think about the contexts in which we can be flexible enough and resilient enough to support and sustain the work that we do. Ambit uses many mentalizing techniques in the face-to-face work with young people, but it's not exclusively that. We would see ambit as being perfectly appropriate in a team that maybe has a cognitive behavioral model of treatment or a whole range of treatments that are evidence-based. So ambit has this sort of map, and in a sense, ordinarily, and maybe through a lot of this conference, we focused quite appropriately on the work that we do with a client. Anthony, before lunch, was talking in this beautiful way about the tension that these two principles that are in opposition, it's very hard to hold both at the same time in working with antisocial personality disorder. You need to scaffold their existing relationships with themselves and their sense that aggression may be an adaptive response, that if I'm too quick to say, don't be aggressive, they're just going to leave. They're not coming back to me. But on the other hand, there's a tension that I need to be seen and properly to be managing the risk that this person may take what I say as implying that a bit of violence here and there is fine. So I'm pulled between these two poles of needing to engage with a system that may be quite out of balance and quite risky, and yet to demonstrate and be clear and certain about my management of risk, so for my own professional safety. That's pretty much all I want to say about the client, because mentalizing, remembering that lovely example of the torch yesterday, really wants us to keep a bit more focus on some of the other areas that we would argue, if you don't pay attention to them, your best efforts in that top quadrant, working with the client, will be undermined. So we think about the work with networks. We need to work across the many domains of these young people's lives to address the complexity of what's caused their complicated difficulties. But at the same time, that leads to many professionals, many agencies, and a risk of what I'm going to talk about as disintegration. So we need to take responsibility where we can for improving that. And equally, we need to focus on team. mentalizing very clearly demonstrates that where change is going to happen, and I'll mention briefly something which I've been surprised has been, I feel, slightly neglected over the conference, which is the concept of epistemic trust. But it's the creation of this close, secure, if you like, attachment, a kind of strong attachment that enables safety and the beginning of mentalizing to develop. But you're creating relationships in this situation with young people who are very risky, who can be seductive. They can invite us to collude with all kinds of risky behaviors. It can invite workers to slip into a rather macho culture where, you know, maybe for me to worry too much about a little bit of crack cocaine is just me being old and boring, and nowadays, you know, maybe that's okay. You know, maybe sex with multiple partners is just me being a bit frigid and prudish. Well, you know, we get drawn into all kinds of very risky positions. So the counter to the formation of strong individual relationships is the relationships that we create with our team, and we need to put as much attention into a mentalizing relationship with our teammates. And then finally, in terms of learning at work, this kind of tension between, there is evidence, but in my field the evidence is patchy, it's weak, and there's a lot of experience, local practice and expertise that very easily, when I come to train a team, the side effect of training a team can be that people who know what they're doing end up feeling as though they've been told that what they've been doing is rubbish and they need to now do this instead. And they feel disempowered instead of empowered. So trying to bridge that tension and that discomfort is important. So I'm going to concentrate on a little bit on networks and then a little bit on teams. Nobody ever that I've heard has stood up and said what we need is more disintegration. People from social care, from the justice system, from health, politicians, everybody says we should do integrated working. And it's very hard to do. So one of the things that we really mark in AMBIT, if you like, this is an ostensive cue. This is saying this is important. Disintegration is the natural resting state of complex multi-agency systems. That's where they are. And unless we engage with that reality, we can't then engage in positive behaviours about trying to address them and trying to minimise the negative impact of that disintegration. So we want to reconfigure expectations in a multi-agency network. Of course it's disintegrated. That's because what we do is more complicated than rocket scientists. They have sums that add up. Our sums just don't add up sometimes. Yeah? It's complicated. It's not an aberration when something goes wrong that requires somebody to feel professional shame that somebody's at fault, somebody's bad, somebody's a failure. This is the natural state of affairs, and we can start to look and become curious about how this happens rather than retreat into psychic equivalence and certainty that all social workers are like this, housing officers don't care, psychiatrists spend too much time playing golf and not enough time actually doing the work, or whatever it is. And likewise, if you think about addressing disintegration and the natural state of these systems as being disintegrated, however we might want it to be, we can rethink reorganization a little bit. That actually a very teleological approach to reorganization, that I just need to rearrange these roles, these systems of authority, these hierarchy, and then it will be fine, it won't be disintegrated, is plainly not true. We've tried to do that for 100 years. It will continue to be disintegrated because that's the nature of the beast. So I suppose beneath all of this is the sense that what we've got to do is get better at working with the systems that we have. I'm not saying reorganizations are never a good idea. Sometimes it's a very helpful thing to do. But what we really need to reorganize is how do we, as a kind of culture of professionals, create systems that are themselves systematically mind-minded, they take the minds of the components of that system seriously. This is a fractal. We heard about Bayesian statistics yesterday, and I'm not going to talk about the mathematics of fractals because I don't understand them, but I like them. So fractals are a graphical way for a computer to actually solve quite sort of simple, often, equations. But if you go onto your iPad or your smartphone and you look for an app that has fractals, they're good fun. You can pinch and expand, and you can go into that picture forever. And you can go into more and more and more detail. And what you find is this notion of patterns that reoccur, that are similar, but they're different. There's endless difference, but that has similar forms. And I think this is a lovely metaphor for the work that we do with young people, where we work from the biological to the political, that you see these disintegrations that look similar and they're different. A team that I want the youth offending team to lock a young person up because he has a huge abscess in his leg and he has a deep vein thrombosis from injecting heroin. And I say, I can't use the law to force treatment on him, but he will die if he's not in hospital. And the only way we can get him into hospital is if you say, we're going to put him in prison now because he's committed many offences. And the youth offending service is saying, that's all very well, but our team is set up to keep people out of prison. So this is a disintegration. We worked it out. But these are the kinds of repetitive sort of misunderstandings, misalignments in systems. So what we're talking about is the introduction of a culture of sort of systematically mentalizing across these complex systems. Ambit tries to provide a sort of series of handholds for when I lose balance. And we have various very simple tools. This is one, we call it a disintegration grid. It's a systematic way of trying to invite workers to mentalize across the agency. We line up all the people that are involved in a young person's care, and we invite just some very simple questions. We think that misunderstanding or poor mentalizing in systems happens at 3 levels: the level of explanation or theory, what's the problem? We think that it might happen at the level of pragmatics, what to do about that problem. And we think that it can happen at the level of system responsibility, who does what. And if you invite a worker, first of all, maybe to just jot a few ideas, here's one I prepared earlier, a few ideas about what the different people in a network think is going on. The invitation is, see if you can write a few points that if the worker saw that, they'd think, yeah, not bad. That's pretty good. Yeah. We know we're going to get this wrong. We can do this with a young person and invite the young person to do it. And I can do it in a multi-agency meeting if we're lucky enough to get everybody in the room. I have a piece of paper on the table, and as people are writing, I'm filling in. And people normally after 3 or 4 minutes say, what are you writing that? And I explain what I'm trying to do is to be clear in my mind about how people understand these things. And then we can do this collaboratively. And the point of this is often to just try to identify, if I had 45 minutes in the next week just to attend to this network, which are the main disintegrations that I think would offer the best chance to kind of connect this network slightly better. I can't talk to everybody in these networks. They are too big. It's too difficult to find them. I'd love to, but the reality is I can't. So how do I select the best places? In this situation, this is a young person who was living with his grandmother, and his problem was that he felt he had no money, so he kept going out and robbing. He wanted the money from his dad, and we invited the grandmother to help him think about his father's lack of money and to help him think about money and what an allowance might be. And we also worked to connect the SENCO in England is a special educational needs coordinator. So they're a worker in a school working with children who have special emotional or behavioural difficulties. And the school and the youth worker were pulling in very different directions about what they think should happen, and just trying to invite and accommodate and strategically set up a conversation between the two so that they could understand each other's position better was our intervention. So we call these connecting, oh my goodness, go, hurry up. So this is just my proof about flexibility. This morning I was walking across the place out there, and I saw this great sign on a building, L'Ordre n'a pas, and it just struck me that this is absolutely what we're talking about, that you could be very rigid and say the spelling of this word has to be perfect, but the meaning of those words still shone through, even though there'd been a bit of rearrangement. And I think we need to create systems where understanding and the meaning and the intention of the agents in these networks is taken more seriously. So just very briefly thinking about the team, one of the analogies we use for the workers who outreach to these young people, see them on benches, in cafes, in their homes, in their schools, wherever the young person thinks is safe, is that they're a little bit like this mountaineer. And it's stressful, it's worrying, you're isolated. So we talk about, certainly in England, there's a very strong notion of this idea of the team around the child. It's a great model. And what I'm suggesting is complementary, not an alternative to that model. When it works, it is great, but a young person and a family to make multiple relationships in that way need a certain history in their relationship building that many of the young people I work with do not have. So we think about this idea of a team around the worker, that what we're interested in particular, is this relationship, this individual relationship with a worker that the young person experiences as being themselves in relationship with other people who help them. So as a worker, I model my relationship to help with the young person. But I'm really focused on epistemic trust. Now, very briefly, epistemic trust, for those of you who don't know, is a very particular kind of trust that is triggered by the experience of being mentalized accurately enough by the other. And it's that, if you like, opens this evolutionarily kind of created pathway for communication, because what it creates in me is a trust in the value of the social knowledge that's in your mind that I might take into my mind. And it's no longer that I just think you believe that. It's that I think that that knowledge that you have might actually work for Caroline or for somebody else. So it's that epistemic trust is that, if you like, the point of mentalizing, is to signal I'm somebody who has information that might be useful for you in other parts of your life. And it's for me, very, very critical. So in the team around the worker, the team's intention is to try to create a mentalizing relationship with this young person, to begin to engage them, but equally, we take as seriously the mentalizing of our colleagues. And this is critical. It's been my experience of working for many years in these kinds of settings that workers can be very compassionate, very mentalizing of their clients, and equally and in opposite ways, non-mentalizing, judgmental, shaming of their professional colleagues. And this is absolutely mirroring the shattered families that these young people come from. We need to work harder to understand each other's minds and states of minds in this tricky work that we do. So we place a lot of emphasis on the rope. Who's holding the rope? Who and how are they signaling that they've got me in view? I don't have time to go into it in great detail, but it's not that different from how an airport runs. Things go wrong and we learn and we create small social rituals and disciplines that help secure a kind of safer way of working. Just as in the Alps, just up there, when a climber starts to climb, there's a ritualized way of talking about that tells me that Caroline is holding my rope and I won't be starting to climb and she's looking the other way and hasn't tied her rope to me. Just to boast a little bit, the British did very well in the Olympics cycling a little while ago, and they had this coach who used this wonderful phrase, Dave Brailsford. He said, "We've got this saying, performance by the aggregation of marginal gains. It means taking the 1% from everything you do, finding a 1% margin for improvement in everything you do. And that's what we try to do from the mechanics upwards. So they just try to improve the slipperiness of their costumes, the preparation of their muscles before the exam, the roundness of the wheels, the this and the that, so that each small improvement just gave them an extra 0.01 second in the race. And Ambit is very much like that, trying to create protocols and disciplines. One that we've used in this communication between workers we call thinking together. I don't have time to talk about it, but it's a mentalizing way of maximizing the likelihood of accurate communication between workers who may be in stressful situations. Finally, and very briefly indeed, we think that the team that starts to manualize its own practice is a team that, if you like, if you can have a group of minds mentalizing themselves, not entirely sure that's possible, but it's an analogy, the team that manualizes itself is, in one sense, mentalizing itself. So we're moving away from treatment manuals as tablets of stone towards, this is a very famous piece of paper, it's called the Archimedes palimpsest. If you look at the text running in one direction, if you look at the text on the other direction, underneath it was what Archimedes wrote some very clever mathematics on. Well, our manuals use the web, they're kind of based on wiki technology, but they enable us to have different layers of ownership of content, so that, and very briefly, I'm coming to the end, and that's a little bit on epistemic trust. We think that the books that you write in the margin of, the books that you write over the pages, those are the books that you remember, not the books that are, you know, all just from things. It needs to have some, if there's some commonality between writing in a book about what we do, how we do this, how this translates into application in our local setting. We think that that, if you like, creates some kind of creation of epistemic trust between a team and its manual. So I won't go into how cleverly and wonderfully we do this, but it means that information can be shared across multiple teams, and when new and wonderful pieces of information break out in local teams, we can bring that down and then share it with everybody. So it's a knowledge management system. And I invite people to go and have a look at that. So I'm very sorry we've slightly overshot. We've trained a lot of people, about 130 teams or more across, mostly in the UK, but across the world increasingly. And we've got some really encouraging, but unfortunately very diverse outcomes. And we're just putting together a paper trying to make sense of these. We've found we've substantially got drawn into being involved in much larger scale kind of training multiple teams across whole locality systems in South London, in West London, and we're about to start one, we hope, very excited about, in Barcelona. But it's difficult when you've got a model that is based on flexibility to know what it is you're testing. So increasingly Ambit's, I think, positioning itself as, if you like, a service improvement model that includes some very concrete clinical application, but is really inviting teams into a kind of a more coherent way about thinking about, are we covering all of these major areas of practice rather than just focusing on what we do in the room with the young person. So I'm sorry to rush through that last bit. Please go and have a look at all our materials. All of our materials, our training and everything is open source, and you can access it through tiddlymanuals.com. Thank you very much. Sorry. Did I go wildly over? Sorry? Did I go really over? No, are you okay?
So we have time for questions. That the audience has any questions. So I would have a first question. I was thinking of how difficult it was to deal with complexity, and I was very interested in the way, the flexibility you're showing, also in the way you present and in all the way you created this Ambit model. And I was wondering, how can it's be implemented in such a wild and a very different kind of worker. And I was wondering, how do you address to court? How do you address to other to the other pole of intervention than the psychiatric one, which is the one you're coming from? How do you contact them to present what AMBIT is and how you'd like to work with them?
That's a very good question. So how do we, if you like, engage maybe a social worker or an educator in a model that might be seen as very sort of mental health? Is that yeah? I think mainly we rely on the very contagious and promiscuous nature of the mentalizing theory, because actually it's a very approachable theory that we've trained many youth workers, social workers, educators in this theory. It speaks to learning, it speaks to engagement, it speaks to, a social worker's understanding of how, fear about housing might well be impacting on a family's ability to manage safety and boundaries in the family. So, I mean, in a sense, our job's been done already by Peter and the clever people over there that have created a theory that is such high face validity. Our experience has been that people have found it very enthusing because it just makes sense of what they know they already do. And that's a very common experience in our trainings, is people say, you're telling us kind of what we do already, and we say, great, what did you expect? You already know what you're doing. We're just creating, if you like, a bit more robust language and an explanation that goes into the psychology of change. But it would be slightly bizarre to be telling people something completely new. Yeah. I've stunned everyone into silence.
Jerry?
Jerry.
Just wondering about the, say, particularly entrenched teams or disintegrated and beleaguered teams with a feeling of powerlessness in the face of all the change, and what kind of, I suppose, steps in the process by. Because I imagine you must also have a process of losing some heart at some point, but being able to maintain a mentalizing stance or someone else supporting you to do that.
So a question about the fact that many of the teams that work in this field, not just in the UK but across Europe and further afield, are very hard pressed, losing workers. I suppose is the question about how do you engage their enthusiasm for any form of change? Is it?
How do you maintain your own mentalizing enthusiasm and optimism in the face of repeated? I'm just thinking in the UK where
that's very interesting.
Where around in many services there's a feeling of everything shrinking and.
I think my sense is. That if you can name something, noticing and naming from the mentalizing loop, but if you can name something in a way that there's a resonance, that people feel that you've understood them, that's hugely comforting for me to sort of feel that they've got it right, that they think I've sort of got it right enough, but also my experiences for teams. So often we will use analogies, but AMBIT is not magic. It's still very, very hard work, and it's still, you get it wrong 70% of the time, and 30% of the time you get it right, and that's probably enough. But I think so analogies or stories about the fact that if training a team is like teaching them some of the ways to kind of handle a boat, to use Trudy's lovely analogy. Actually, you have to remember there are some very major storm force winds. Some of the teams we train are sitting there knowing that in the next year they will lose 20% of their staff. So if you're sitting in a training thinking, I may not have a job in 6 months' time, it's hard to attend to too much. But I think to name that with the team and to share that as one of the dilemmas that makes the work that you do incredibly stressful. I have a fantasy that rocket scientists don't have any funding crises, that they just seem to have money falling out of the sky. They've got Elon Musk. But the reality is that this is one of the things that makes the work that we do hard, because we are underfunded, we are under-resourced, we're appreciated, I think, by governments and by people. So, and I think for teams to feel that you sort of recognise that, at least we share the pain.
Yeah, thank you.
So it would be a validation of the team's difficulties as well as the validation of how difficult the clients are.
Yeah, because validation is, the sense of being mentalized, isn't it? When I feel that you've validated me, I feel, gosh, okay, I see it now in you, yeah.
Hi. Could you say a bit more about reducing professional shame? Would that go along with what you've just said about validating teams and what they're struggling with?
Yes, I suppose one of the other things that we would nail home very early in trainings would be this work makes us anxious. Hopefully not all the time, but definitely some of the time. And it's amazing how often my own anxiety about the work that I'm doing switches to a kind of professional shame that somehow that means I'm not very good at this work. Whereas we would argue that it's the nature of this work to be anxious. If you're not anxious doing this work at times, you really should leave. You're really not engaged with the risks. You're not engaged with reality. So the question is to sort of, if you like, again, restate, not only is a system's disintegrated and we can either get into blaming and shaming, but at a personal level, my anxiety is part of, I don't know why I chose to work in this field, but I seriously love it. But I chose to work in a field where a certain percentage of my week, I am sitting there thinking, and that's the nature. Now, I need a team that notice sometimes more than I do when I am anxious, and don't see that as a personal failure, but can engage with me and think about how that state of anxiety may or may not help me or not help me to make better clinical decisions. So I suppose that would be one of the sort of examples about professional shame. But yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's helpful. Thanks.
So we have time for a last question.
Thank you. So hearing you just say about the connection and the shift between anxiety and professional shame just made me wonder whether the link of that to epistemic trust, that perhaps paradoxically your staff, other team members, seeing you express your anxiety, noticing actually perversely increases their epistemic trust.
I think that's actually completely on the nail. What we would like to see is teams where there is an absolute openness and an expectation that people come to a team meeting and they don't say, this is a really great piece of work that I'm doing, aren't I good? That they come to the team meeting with a very clear thing, I'm a bit stuck with this one. What I want from this team, and this would what we would call marking the task. So when we have a team meeting and we discuss cases, you can't come to that team meeting without having, if you like, in our words, kickstart your own mentalizing. Why am I bringing this case for discussion? And the invitation is, don't bring a case that you feel you're doing really well on. That's just a waste of everybody's time. Bring a case that you're a bit stuck on, or you could go one of two ways and you just can't work out where to do it. And I think that sort of invitation for a team to be more open about where we're lost, confused, furious with another part of the network in a way that we sort of know is probably non-mentalising. So we're trying to create teams where there is a more authentic relationships between people, which is not comfortable. There's a level of intimacy in that working that, you know, not all of us feel great about. Does that